Human beings have always looked upward for answers. We've searched the stars for patterns, for meaning, for some sign that we're not alone in the vastness. We've built telescopes and sent signals into the void, hoping something might answer back. But sometimes the sky doesn't wait for our questions. Sometimes it looks back first. Tonight, we're gathering accounts of encounters that resist easy explanation. Not lights in the distance, not blurred photographs, but direct contact with beings that shouldn't exist according to our understanding of reality. Some witnesses describe them as extraterrestrial, travelers from distant worlds. Others aren't so sure, sensing something stranger, entities that might slip between dimensions or manifest from places that don't map onto our geography of stars and planets. The people who share these stories don't always agree on what they experienced. Some are certain they met alien visitors. Others think they encountered something that exists alongside our reality, visible only under certain conditions, in certain moments of awareness. A few believe they touched something that was both and neither, something so foreign to human experience that our categories of alien and interdimensional are equally inadequate to describe it. What they agree on is that the encounters changed them, left them with questions that have no comfortable answers, with memories that don't fade the way normal memories do, with the sense that they've been marked or noticed or studied by intelligences that operate according to rules we don't understand. These are stories told quietly, often only to people who might believe them, shared with the hope that someone else has experienced something similar and can confirm that these moments were real, that they happened, that the witnesses aren't imagining patterns and randomness or mistaking the mundane for the miraculous. We're not here to judge these accounts or explain them away. We're simply gathering them, presenting them as they were told to us, letting you decide what they might mean. Because in the space between what we know and what we experience, there's room for something genuine, encounters that are real even if they don't fit our models of how reality should work. These are the moments that live between explanation and memory, between stars and shadows. These are the accounts of people who looked into the unknown and found it looking back, found it reaching out, found it making contact in ways that were unmistakable but impossible to prove. Let these stories carry you gently into sleep, into that space where the boundaries of the real become soft and permeable, where the impossible and the experienced coexist without contradiction. Rest easy and listen carefully. These encounters happen to someone. Maybe they could happen to anyone. Story 1: The Visitor by the Water. I inherited my grandfather's cabin on Lake Superior's North Shore, a place so remote that the nearest neighbor was 3 miles through forest. It sat on a rocky point with a big lake stretching out forever to the east, and in summer, the water was cold and clear enough to see 20 feet down. I'd go up there when I needed to think, when the city felt too loud and too crowded, when I needed to remember what silence actually sounded like. This was in late September, after the tourists had left, but before the serious cold set in. I'd driven up on a Friday evening, planning to spend a long weekend alone with books and the sound of waves on rocks. The cabin had no electricity. My grandfather had been old-fashioned that way, so I relied on propane lanterns and candles. No phone service, no internet. Just me and the lake and whatever weather rolled in. The first 2 nights were unremarkable. I read by lamplight, cooked simple meals on the propane stove, walked along the shore at dusk watching the water change colors as the sun dropped. I slept deeply in that way you only can when you're far from artificial light and electronic noise, when your body remembers older rhythms and settles into them. The 3rd night, I woke around 3 in the morning to use the outhouse. I was groggy, fumbling for my flashlight when I noticed light coming through the cabin's east window, the one that faced the lake. Not the gray pre-dawn light, and not the warm flicker of northern lights I'd seen there before. This was whiter, steadier, and it was moving. I went to the window and looked out. The light was on the lake, maybe 100 yards from shore, hovering about 10 feet above the water's surface. It wasn't a searchlight or a boat. The beam wasn't focused that way, and there was no visible source. It was more like a luminous form, vaguely spherical, but with edges that seemed to pulse and shift, casting light in all directions. What struck me immediately was that the water beneath it wasn't reflecting the light. The lake was perfectly still, no wind that night. And normally, when light hits water at night, you see a reflection, a mirror image. But the lake under this thing remained dark, as if the light was passing through it, or existing on a different plane that the water couldn't see. I watched for maybe 5 minutes, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The light moved slowly along the shoreline, staying at the same height above the water, maintaining the same distance from shore. It had a purposeful quality to it, like it was searching for something or following some route I couldn't perceive. Then it stopped, directly in line with my cabin. It hung there, pulsing gently, and I felt this sudden awareness that it knew I was watching. I can't explain how I knew that. There was no indication, no change in behavior. But the certainty hit me like a physical sensation. It was aware of my presence, and it had stopped for me. I don't remember deciding to go outside. I found myself on the rocky shore in my bare feet and sleeping clothes, the cabin door hanging open behind me, the night air cold enough that my breath made clouds. The light was still there, closer now, maybe 50 feet from shore and at eye level. This close, I could see it wasn't solid. It was more like concentrated luminescence, light that had taken form without needing a physical container. And then I saw the figure within it, or emerging from it, or made of it. Language fails here, because what I saw didn't conform to how things are supposed to work. There was a shape that suggested a body, tall, slender, with limbs and a head, but it was composed entirely of light, or perhaps it was light that had organized itself into the suggestion of a body. It wasn't standing on the water so much as existing at that location, with the lake somehow irrelevant to its presence. The figure turned toward me. I say turned, but it might be more accurate to say its attention shifted in my direction, and then it spoke. Not out loud, there was no sound, but I heard words, or what my brain interpreted as words, except they weren't external. They formed inside my head, in my own mental voice, but saying things I wasn't thinking. "You come here when the noise is too much," the voice said, and it was my voice, my exact internal monologue voice, but it was saying things I hadn't formulated. "You remember swimming in this lake as a child. You remember your grandfather teaching you to identify stars. You think about him often." These were true statements, things I did think about when I was at the cabin, but hearing them reflected back at me, spoken in my own mental voice but from an external source, was profoundly disorienting. It was like having my thoughts read and then played back to me through my own consciousness. "We notice the quiet ones," the voice continued, "the ones who step back from the noise and listen. We've been watching this place for a long time, longer than your grandfather lived here, longer than humans have had language." I tried to respond, tried to form a question, but my thoughts were scattered, incoherent. The presence of this thing, this being, was overwhelming in a way that had nothing to do with fear. It was more like my consciousness was too small to properly contain the awareness of what I was experiencing. like trying to hold the ocean in a cup. You want to understand, the voice said, still using my own mental patterns. That's why you're here, in this moment. But understanding isn't what you need. Witnessing is enough. The figure raised what might have been an arm, gesturing toward the forest behind my cabin. Then it began to fade, not disappearing suddenly, but gradually losing coherence, the light dimming and dispersing until it was just a glow, then just a subtle brightening of the night sky, then nothing. I stood on the rocks for a long time, shaking from cold or from the encounter. I couldn't tell. Eventually, I walked back to the cabin, closed the door, lit a lamp, and sat at the small table, trying to process what had happened. I'd experienced something impossible, but it had been completely real. I had no doubt about that. Whatever I'd seen and heard had occurred exactly as I remembered it occurring. As the sky began to lighten toward dawn, I went back outside to look at the shore where I'd been standing, and there on the rocks I found marks. Not footprints exactly, but impressions, as if something had pressed into the stone and left a trace. They were shallow, barely visible, but definitely there. 3 parallel lines, each about 6 inches long, arranged in a triangular pattern. They led from where I'd been standing toward the forest. I followed them. They continued into the woods, appearing on rocks and bare earth, always the same pattern, always spaced as if something was walking with a stride, longer than human, but following the easiest path through the trees. I followed for maybe 1/4 of a mile before they ended abruptly at the base of a large white pine. No marks beyond that point, as if whatever had left them had simply stopped existing at that location. I spent the rest of the day at the cabin, reading and trying to act normal, trying to convince myself I could integrate this experience into my understanding of reality, but I couldn't. I had seen something that shouldn't exist, had communicated with something that spoke through my own thoughts, had followed its marks into the forest where they simply ended. I left the next morning earlier than I'd planned, not because I was afraid exactly, but because I needed to be around other people, needed the reassurance of ordinary reality. I needed to see cars and buildings and hear human voices talking about mundane things. I needed to remind myself that the normal world still existed and I was still part of it. I went back to the cabin several times after that. Each time I hoped I might see the light again, might have another encounter, might be given more information about what I'd witnessed, but the lake remained just a lake, beautiful and cold and completely ordinary. The forest was just forest, full of normal wildlife and ordinary trees, and nothing that left 3-lined impressions on rocks. But my dreams changed, not every night and not in ways I could always remember clearly, but sometimes I'd wake with the sense that I'd been thinking in a different mode, processing information in a way that wasn't quite human. Sometimes I'd remember fragments, patterns of light, geometric arrangements, the sense of vast distances and impossible perspectives. And sometimes, just sometimes, I'd hear that voice again, my own internal voice speaking thoughts I hadn't generated, saying things like, "We're still watching," or "The quiet ones are important," or "Some bridges only work in one direction." I don't know what I encountered that night on Lake Superior. I've read about close encounters, about alien visitations, about interdimensional beings. None of the accounts quite match my experience. The thing I saw wasn't mechanical, wasn't a typical gray alien, wasn't trying to abduct me or conduct experiments. It was something else, something that existed in or near our reality, something that could perceive human consciousness directly, something that communicated by using our own mental processes against us in ways that felt intrusive and intimate and strangely gentle all at once. My grandfather used to say that the big lake had moods, that it was alive in ways that couldn't be explained by water and wind and geology. I thought he was being poetic, attributing personality to natural forces. But now I wonder if he'd seen something too, if he'd encountered something during his decades at that cabin, if that was why he chose to live there alone, far from the noise and the crowds, maintaining vigil at the edge of something vast and strange. I still go to the cabin, though not as often. I still watch the lake at night, looking for lights that don't reflect on the water. And I still sometimes wake with thoughts in my head that I didn't put there, spoken in my own voice, but saying things I didn't know I knew. Maybe the encounter marked me somehow, opened a channel that wasn't there before. Or maybe I was always receiving these thoughts and only became aware of them after I knew what to listen for. Either way, I'm not the same person I was before that September night. I'm someone who knows with absolute certainty that we're not alone, that something else shares this reality or borders it closely, that consciousness is more permeable and more strange than we typically acknowledge. That's a difficult knowledge to carry, but it's also oddly comforting. The universe is weirder and more populous than most people believe, and somewhere in that weirdness, there are beings who notice the quiet ones, who watch from lakes and forests, who sometimes reach across the gap and speak to us in our own voices. Have you ever heard your own thoughts echo back from somewhere they shouldn't? Story 2, The Woman on the Highway. I drove trucks for 30 years, crisscrossing the western states, spending more time on highways than in any home I ever had. You see things when you drive at night. Strange lights, odd weather, animals that shouldn't be where they are. Most of it has explanations. Probably all of it does, if you dig deep enough. But there's one thing that happened to me outside of Tonopah, Nevada, in 1987 that I've never been able to explain away. It was late summer, one of those nights where the heat doesn't break even after sunset. I was hauling electronics from California to Utah, taking Route 95 through the center of Nevada because it was the most direct route. The highway was empty. I might see another vehicle every 15 or 20 minutes, and even that was more traffic than usual for that stretch. Around 2 a.m, I saw someone standing beside the road, just standing there, maybe 10 feet from the shoulder, caught in my headlights. A woman, or what looked like a woman, wearing a dress that seemed wrong for the heat and the location. She wasn't hitchhiking, no thumb out, no bag visible, just standing perfectly still as I approached. I should have kept driving. Every trucker knows you don't stop for hitchhikers, especially not alone on empty highways in the middle of nowhere. But there was something about her stillness, about the way she just stood there without waving or moving, that made me slow down. Not a conscious decision. My foot just eased off the accelerator and I found myself pulling in onto the shoulder about 30 feet past where she was standing. I sat there for a minute, debating whether to drive on. But the idea of leaving someone stranded in that heat miles from anywhere didn't sit right. I checked my mirrors, saw her walking toward the truck with an odd gliding gait that might have been the heat shimmer on the pavement playing with my vision. She reached the passenger door and looked up at me through the window. Her face was pale, unremarkable, the kind of face you'd forget immediately in any normal circumstance. But her eyes were wrong, not the color or the shape, but the way they didn't quite focus on anything, like she was looking through me at something behind or beyond. I rolled down the window. "You need a ride somewhere?" She nodded once, a mechanical gesture, and reached for the door handle. I unlocked it, and she climbed up into the cab with a smoothness that didn't match her appearance. She was wearing a dress that looked like it was from the 1950s, floral pattern, knee length, completely out of place for 1987 and completely impractical for the Nevada desert. "Where you headed?" I asked. She didn't answer, just sat there, hands folded in her lap, staring straight ahead through the windshield. I waited a few seconds, then put the truck in gear and pulled back onto the highway. Having a silent passenger was strange, but not necessarily threatening. Some people don't like to talk, especially if they're in trouble or running from something. We drove for maybe 10 minutes in silence. I kept glancing over at her, trying to figure out what was off beyond the obvious. She didn't move, didn't fidget, didn't look around, just stared straight ahead with that unfocused gaze, hands perfectly still in her lap. Then the lightning started. Not in the sky. There were no clouds, no storm approaching. The lightning came from inside the cab, or seemed to. Brief flickers of blue-white light that outlined her form, making her edges glow for a fraction of a second. It happened 3 or 4 times, irregular intervals, like static discharge, but brighter and with no accompanying sound. I nearly pulled over again. "Are you all right? Have you seen the others?" Her voice was flat, toneless, like she was reading from a script she didn't understand. The question made no sense in context. "The others?" I repeated. "What others?" She turned to look at me then, and when she did, another flicker of light outlined her entire body. In that brief flash, she looked different, thinner, taller, with features that didn't quite match what I'd seen before. Then the flash ended, and she was just a woman in an old-fashioned dress again. "Have you seen them?" she repeated. Same flat tone. "The ones who walk between. The ones who watch the roads." "I don't know what you're talking about," I said, and I was starting to get genuinely scared now. Not of her exactly, but of the situation, of the wrongness that was becoming impossible to ignore. She faced forward again. "They're everywhere, on all the roads, watching for something. Have you seen them?" "Who are they? Who are you talking about?" But she didn't answer. Just sat there, silent again, while the lightning flickered around her edges every minute or so. I was gripping the steering wheel hard enough that my hands ached, trying to decide whether to pull over and ask her to get out or just keep driving until we reached the next town where I could drop her off with other people around. Before I could decide, she spoke again. "Thank you for stopping." Same flat voice, but there was something final in it, like she was saying goodbye. "We're not there yet," I said. "Where do you need to go?" "I'm already where I need to be," she said, and then she was gone. Not gradually, not like she opened the door and jumped out. She was there and then she wasn't, between one moment and the next, as completely as if she'd never existed. The passenger seat was empty. The door was still closed and locked from the inside. There was no sound, no displacement of air, nothing. She simply ceased to be present in the cab of my truck. I pulled over hard, nearly putting the truck in the ditch. Got out, walked around the vehicle, checked inside and underneath, looked at the road behind me for any sign of someone walking or lying hurt. Nothing. The highway stretched empty in both directions, heat still radiating from the pavement, and I was completely alone. I got back in the truck and just sat there, shaking, trying to make sense of what had happened. People don't vanish. They don't flicker with lightning. They don't appear out of nowhere on empty highways wearing clothes from 40 years earlier and asking cryptic questions about others and the ones who watch the roads. I drove to Tonopah without stopping again, found a diner that was open despite the late hour, and sat drinking coffee until my hands stopped shaking and the sun came up. I thought about reporting it to the police, but what would I say? I picked up a hitchhiker who vanished from my locked truck. They'd think I'd been hallucinating, that I'd fallen asleep at the wheel and dreamed the whole thing. But it wasn't a dream. I know the difference between dream and reality, between imagination and experience. I picked up something on that highway. It spoke to me, asked me a question I couldn't answer, thanked me for stopping, and then ceased to exist. That happened exactly as I remember it happening. I finished that delivery, drove back through Nevada several times over the following months, always looking for her, always watching the roadside for someone standing in the wrong place wearing the wrong clothes. But I never saw her again. The highway remained just a highway, ordinary and empty and completely mundane, except for the radio. This started maybe 2 weeks after the encounter and continued for months afterward. I'd be driving at night, scanning through channels, and I'd catch fragments of a voice that sounded like hers, that same flat, toneless quality. Never a full sentence, just words or phrases embedded in the static between stations. Have you seen them? Or watching the roads? Or thank you for stopping? The first few times I thought it was random, my brain finding patterns in noise because I was thinking about the encounter. But it happened too often, always at night, always on stretches of highway that felt similar to that route through Nevada. And once, just once, I heard something that made me pull over and sit in silence for an hour. I was outside of Ely, Nevada. Different highway but similar desert landscape, probably 3 months after the original encounter. Scanning through stations late at night, and I caught a clear transmission in that voice. They're still looking. The ones who stopped. The ones who asked questions. Be careful on the roads. It wasn't a broadcast. There was no station identification, no music before or after. Just that single message embedded in static, and then nothing. I sat there with the radio on, turning the dial slowly through every frequency, but I never found that transmission again. I drove trucks for another 15 years after that encounter, and I never stopped for anyone on the road again. If I saw someone standing alone on a highway, I'd call it into highway patrol and let them handle it. Maybe that makes me a worse person, less willing to help someone in need. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd been tested somehow, or maybe marked, and that picking up the wrong hitchhiker again might lead somewhere I wasn't prepared to go. Sometimes I think about her question, "Have you seen the others?" And I wonder if I have. If maybe every strange thing I've seen on the road over 30 years was part of whatever she was part of. If there really are beings that walk between something, watching the highways for reasons I can't fathom. I retired in 2002, settled down in a small town in Oregon, stopped spending my nights on empty roads, but I still listen to the radio at night sometimes, scanning through the static, listening for that voice. I haven't heard it in years, but I keep listening anyway, because she thanked me for stopping, and maybe that means something. Maybe picking her up, whatever she was, mattered in some way I'll never understand. Or maybe I'm just an old trucker who had a strange experience once and can't let it go, who hears patterns and randomness because the human brain needs explanations for things it can't explain. But I don't think so. I think there really are others on the roads, walking between something and our reality, appearing to certain people under certain conditions, asking questions we can't answer, and then vanishing back to wherever they came from. Maybe they travel the same roads we do, just on a different layer of the map. Have you ever seen something that didn't quite belong, but kept looking back at you anyway? Story 3, static in the orchard. I taught elementary school in Maine for 35 years before I retired to a small property outside of Dover Foxcroft. The property came with an old apple orchard, maybe 40 trees, that hadn't been properly maintained in years, but still produced decent fruit. I spent my first retirement autumn pruning and cleaning up, getting the orchard back into some kind of order, enjoying the physical work after decades of mental work with children. It was early October, that perfect time when the leaves are turning but haven't fallen yet, when the air is cool enough for a jacket, but the sun is still warm at midday. I was working in the orchard around 4 in the afternoon, cutting back water sprouts and dead branches, when I noticed movement in my peripheral vision. 3 figures, small and low to the ground, moving between the trees about 40 feet away. My first thought was children, but we're remote enough that kids don't just wander through. My second thought was deer, but the movement was wrong, too deliberate, too upright. I set down my pruning saw and walked toward them, assuming they were neighbors I hadn't met yet, maybe looking for lost dogs or cats. As I got closer, I realized they weren't human. They weren't deer either. They were maybe 4 feet tall, with proportions that seemed almost right, but slightly off. Limbs too long for their bodies, heads too large, movements that were awkward and stilted, like they weren't quite adapted to moving in Earth's gravity. They were examining the apple trees with what looked like metallic rods, maybe 18 inches long, that they'd hold near the bark or the leaves for a few seconds before moving to the next tree. They worked methodically, with the focused attention of scientists conducting research, completely unaware of my presence or unconcerned by it. I stopped about 20 feet away, frozen not by fear, but by sheer disbelief. What I was seeing shouldn't exist. The figures were real, solid, casting shadows in the afternoon sun, but they were impossible. Their skin, if it was skin, had a grayish blue tone. They wore no clothing that I could see, but they didn't appear naked exactly. More like their surfaces were natural, like dolphin skin or something similar. One of them turned and looked at me, not quickly, not startled, just a slow rotation of its head until its eyes, large, dark, almond-shaped, were fixed on my face. And in that moment, the world went silent. Not quiet, silent completely, absolutely silent. The wind that had been moving through the orchard stopped making sound. The birds that had been calling to each other became mute. My own breathing, my heartbeat, the rustling of my jacket, all sound ceased completely. The silence lasted maybe 10 seconds, though it felt longer, felt eternal. During those 10 seconds, the being and I looked at each other, and I had the overwhelming sense that I was being assessed, measured, cataloged in some way I couldn't understand. Not threatened. There was no menace in its gaze, but definitely evaluated, like a biologist examining a specimen, noting its characteristics, determining whether it was worth further study. Then sound returned all at once, a rush of ordinary noise that was almost painful after the complete silence. The being turned away from me, back to whatever it and its companions were doing with the apple trees. I stood there still frozen, watching them continue their work as if nothing had happened, as if the 10 seconds of absolute silence hadn't occurred. I don't know how long I watched them. Could have been 5 minutes, could have been 30. Time felt slippery, unreliable. Eventually, they seemed to finish whatever they were doing. They moved as a group toward the far edge of the orchard, still making those awkward movements that suggested they weren't built for this environment. And then they were gone. Not dramatically, no flash of light or teleportation effect. They just reached the tree line and continued into the forest, and I lost sight of them among the pines. I walked to where they'd been, examined the trees they'd examined. Nothing looked different. The bark was intact. The leaves were normal. The branches were the same as they'd been. But I could feel a difference. Something about the energy or the presence of that space had changed in ways I couldn't articulate. I went inside, made coffee, and sat at my kitchen table trying to process what I'd witnessed. 3 small beings with metallic rods, examining my apple trees with scientific precision, imposing complete silence when one of them looked at me. It was absurd. It was impossible. But it had happened. That night I barely slept. I kept thinking about the silence, about the assessment I'd felt in that gaze, about what they might have been doing with those rods. Were they taking samples, measuring something, modifying the trees in some way? And why my orchard? What made this particular location, these particular trees, worth their attention? In the morning, I went back to the orchard with my camera, intending to photograph the trees they'd examined, to document anything unusual, and I found them. 3 circular scorch marks on the ground, arranged in a triangular pattern, each about 18 inches in diameter. The grass inside the circles was blackened and dead. The soil was hard and compacted, as if it had been subjected to intense heat or pressure. The marks were positioned exactly where I'd seen the beings working. I photographed them from multiple angles, measured them, noted their positions relative to the trees. Each circle was perfectly round, the edges sharply defined with no gradual transition from scorched to normal. It looked like someone had placed hot metal discs on the ground, but there was no way to explain why or how, and no evidence of anything that could have produced such marks. I contacted the county extension office, asked if they knew what could cause circular burn patterns in grass. They suggested fungal infections or chemical burns, sent someone out to take samples. The results came back inconclusive. The soil chemistry was normal. There was no evidence of fungal growth or chemical contamination. The grass was simply dead, killed by unknown means. Over the following months, I watched those trees carefully, looking for any sign that they'd been affected by whatever the beings had done. The trees seemed normal through the rest of autumn and into winter, but the next spring, those specific trees bloomed earlier and more vigorously than the others. Their apples that fall were larger, with more intense color and flavor. Whatever had been done to them seemed to have enhanced them somehow. The scorch marks remain. The grass never grew back in those circles, even after I reseeded. They're still there. Visible brown circles in my orchard, reminder of an afternoon when 3 beings came to study my apple trees and imposed 10 seconds of complete silence while they assessed whether I was a threat or simply a curiosity. I never saw them again. I spent many afternoons in that orchard over subsequent years, sometimes sitting quietly for hours, watching and waiting, hoping they'd return so I could understand more about what I'd witnessed. But the orchard remained just an orchard, visited only by birds and deer and the occasional wandering cat from a neighbor's farm. But those 10 seconds of silence changed something in me. I became aware of how much noise we live with constantly, how rare true silence is in our modern world, and I became attuned to moments when silence falls unexpectedly, when the birds suddenly stop singing or the wind momentarily pauses, because those moments feel different now. They feel significant, like reality briefly holding its breath, like something might be watching or passing through, just beyond the edge of my perception. I think about what it must have been like for them, working in our gravity, examining our trees with their instruments, being unexpectedly observed by a retired teacher with a pruning saw, Did they find what they were looking for? Were they disappointed to be interrupted? That assessment in the one's eyes, was it concern that I might be dangerous, or merely acknowledgement that I was present? Some say silence is a kind of language, one we haven't learned to fear yet. If you were them, would you hide from us or study us? Story 4. The Light Under the Floorboards. My grandmother told me this story before she died, made me promise to remember it exactly as she told it, insisted it was important, even though she couldn't explain why. This happened in 1953, when she was 32 years old and living in an old farmhouse in the Appalachian Mountains of western North Carolina, raising 3 children with my grandfather while he worked in the coal mines. The farmhouse was over 100 years old, built on a stone foundation with a crawl space underneath instead of a full basement. My grandmother said you could access the crawl space through a small door in the back of the mudroom, but there was never any reason to go down there except when pipes froze in winter or when you needed to check for structural problems. It started in November. My grandmother's youngest daughter, who would have been about 5 years old, began having vivid dreams about green light coming from under her bedroom floor. She'd describe it at breakfast, how the light would shine through the floorboards in a pattern, how it would pulse in rhythm with her heartbeat, how it felt warm and made her feel safe. My grandmother dismissed it as childhood imagination. Children have active dream lives, especially in old houses that make settling noises at night. But then, the middle child, a son who was 7, started reporting similar dreams. Same green light, same pattern through the floorboards, same pulsing rhythm. He was more specific. He said the light knew when he was asleep, that it only appeared after he closed his eyes. When the oldest child, a daughter who was 9, started describing the same dreams, my grandmother became concerned. All 3 children sleeping in different rooms, having identical dreams about green light pulsing under their floors. That wasn't imagination, that was something else. My grandfather was skeptical. He thought the children were influencing each other, that the youngest had told a story that the others had adopted and elaborated on. But my grandmother insisted they check the crawl space just to rule out any practical explanations. Maybe some kind of phosphorescent fungus, or light reflecting from somewhere through cracks in the foundation. So one evening, after the children were in bed, my grandfather took a lantern and went down into the crawl space while my grandmother watched from the access door. He reported that everything looked normal. Dirt floor, stone foundation walls, wooden beams supporting the floor above. No signs of anything unusual, no fungus, no cracks letting in external light, no explanation for the children's shared dreams. But that night, my grandmother couldn't sleep. She lay awake thinking about the dreams, about the specificity of the details, about how all 3 children had described the exact same phenomenon. Around 2 in the morning, she got up and went to check on the children. All 3 were asleep, and as she stood in the hallway between their rooms, she saw it. A faint green glow, barely visible, coming from the gaps between the floorboards in all 3 bedrooms. It was exactly as the children had described, a pulsing light, rhythmic, moving in patterns that seemed deliberate somehow. She woke my grandfather. He saw it too. They went back down to the crawl space with the lantern, expecting to find the source of the light underneath the children's rooms. But there was nothing. The crawl space remained completely dark and ordinary. The light was somehow visible from above, but not from below, as if it existed in the floorboards themselves or passed through them from some direction that wasn't simply underneath. This continued for 3 weeks. Every night after the children fell asleep, the green light would appear, pulsing through the floorboards in their rooms. My grandparents would go down to the crawl space and find nothing. The light couldn't be explained by any practical means. It had no visible source, cast no shadows, and apparently existed only when viewed from above, only when the children were sleeping. The children weren't frightened by it. In fact, they seemed comforted by the light. They slept better during those weeks than they ever had before. They woke happy and refreshed, describing dreams that were vivid but pleasant. Dreams about traveling to places that didn't quite match any geography they knew, about meeting people who spoke in sounds rather than words, about learning things they couldn't remember when they woke, but that left them feeling wise somehow. My grandmother decided they needed to know what was causing this. She convinced my grandfather to dig up the floor of the crawl space directly beneath where the light appeared strongest, beneath the youngest daughter's room. He was reluctant. They were poor, and repairing the floor would be expensive if they damaged it. But my grandmother was insistent. Something was happening to their children, something unexplainable, and she needed to understand it. So one weekend, my grandfather went down with a shovel and began digging. The dirt in the crawl space was hard-packed, undisturbed for decades. He dug down about 3 feet, finding nothing unusual, just more dirt, some rocks, the normal composition of Appalachian soil. But my grandmother, watching from above in her daughter's room, saw the light change. As my grandfather dug, the pulsing became more rapid, more insistent. The green glow brightened until it was clearly visible even in daylight. And she said she felt something, a presence, an awareness, a sense that whatever was producing the light was reacting to being disturbed. She called down to my grandfather to stop digging. He came back up, his hands dirty, his expression puzzled. "There's nothing down there," he said. "Just dirt and rocks, nothing that could produce light." That night, the light didn't appear. The children went to sleep normally, but they were restless, tossing and turning, waking several times. In the morning, they seemed subdued, almost sad. My grandmother asked what was wrong, and the youngest said, "The light is gone. It's not coming back. It's sad that we dug." Over the next few days, the children returned to their normal sleep patterns, but they all reported feeling like they'd lost something, like a friend had moved away. They'd ask occasionally if the light might come back, and when told it probably wouldn't, they'd accept this with a resignation that seemed too mature for their ages. My grandmother went down to the crawl space one more time, standing in the place where my grandfather had dug. The hole had been filled back in, the dirt packed down, everything returned to how it had been. But she stood there for a long time, and she said she felt foolish for what she was about to do. But she did it anyway. She spoke out loud, addressing whatever might be listening. She said she was sorry for disturbing it, that they'd only been trying to understand, to protect their children. She said she knew something had been there, something that had somehow connected with her children through their dreams, and that she was grateful it hadn't harmed them, that it had in fact seemed to comfort them. She didn't expect a response, but she felt something, not a voice, not a physical sensation, but a kind of acknowledgement, like whatever had been there had heard her, had understood, had accepted the apology. And she knew with certainty that it was gone, that it had left or withdrawn or returned to wherever it had come from. Years later, when the children were grown, my grandmother asked them if they remembered the green light under their floors. All three did, clearly and vividly, even though it had happened when they were young enough that most early memories fade. They described it the same way they had as children, comforting, rhythmic, warm. and they all said they'd felt sad when it left, like something important had been taken away before they were ready to let it go. My great aunt, the youngest daughter, told me years later that she still sometimes dreams about the light. She's in her 70s now, living in Florida, far from those Appalachian mountains, but she'll dream about sleeping in that old bedroom, seeing the green glow through the floorboards, feeling that pulsing rhythm that matched her heartbeat. And she'll wake feeling peaceful, like she's been visited by something old and patient and kind. My grandmother never found an explanation for what happened. She considered many possibilities, some natural phenomenon, some property of the soil or the rocks beneath the house, some effect of the old stone foundation, but none of these explanations accounted for the light appearing only when the children slept, for it reacting to being disturbed by digging, for the children's shared dreams and the sense of presence that my grandmother felt when she apologized in the empty crawl space. She came to believe in her later years that something had been living beneath that farmhouse, not living in a physical sense perhaps, but existing there, present there, watching over the children for reasons she couldn't understand. She said the light felt old, ancient, like it had been there long before the house was built, long before humans came to those mountains. Maybe it was watching over something else before us, she told me. Maybe it watched over the Cherokee who lived there before white settlers came. Maybe it's been there since the mountains formed, just existing, just being, occasionally noticed by whoever happens to be sleeping above it. She insisted the light hadn't been dangerous, that it had in fact been protective, that her children had been blessed or watched over or connected to something during those 3 weeks that most people never experience. And she regretted disturbing it, regretted driving it away through their attempts to understand it. Some things don't want to be understood, she said. They just want to be. And maybe that's enough. Maybe being noticed and letting yourself notice back is the whole point. The farmhouse is gone now, torn down decades ago when the coal company bought the land, but the site is still there, a flat area on a hillside overgrown with trees and brush. My great aunt visited it once in the 1990s, walked to where she thought her childhood bedroom had been, stood there for a long time looking at the ground. She told me she didn't see any light, didn't feel any presence, but she said thank you anyway, out loud, to the air and the earth and whatever might still be listening. She thanked it for the dreams, for the comfort, for the connection to something beyond ordinary experience. And she said she's sorry they disturbed it, sorry they dug, sorry they drove it away, before she was old enough to properly appreciate what was happening. I think about that story often, about what my grandmother and her children experienced, about the green light pulsing through old floorboards in rhythm with children's heartbeats, about something ancient and patient existing beneath a farmhouse in the Appalachian Mountains. I think about how we encountered it, studied it, and in our attempts to understand it, made it leave. Maybe not all lights in the dark are meant to be followed. Maybe some are meant to be noticed, appreciated, and left alone. Have you ever felt like something was watching from underneath your world, not threatening, but present, aware, keeping its own counsel while you sleep above it, dreaming dreams that feel like they're coming from somewhere else? Story 5, Transmission 19. I'm going to tell you about something that happened to my uncle in 1991, something that ended his amateur radio hobby and changed him in ways the family never fully understood. He was a communications engineer by profession, worked for a tech company in Hampshire, England, but his real passion was ham radio. He had an entire room in his house dedicated to radio equipment, transmitters, receivers, antennas, all the gear that serious amateur radio operators, collect over years of the hobby. He'd spend hours at night talking to people around the world, participating in contests to make contact with the most distant stations, handling emergency communications during disasters. It was his way of connecting with people, of being part of a global community united by radio waves and technical knowledge. In March of 1991, he began receiving unusual transmissions on a frequency he'd been monitoring. The frequency was in a band allocated for amateur use, but the transmissions weren't following standard amateur radio protocols. No call signs, no identification, just bursts of data that sounded like digital encoding of some kind. He recorded these transmissions, ran them through various decoding software, tried to make sense of them. The pattern that emerged was strange. The transmissions consisted of prime numbers, just prime numbers, transmitted in sequence, starting from 2 and working upward, 2, 3, 5, 7, 11, 13, 17, 19, and so on. They'd reach a certain point, maybe up to 400 or 500, and then start over from the beginning. Prime numbers are significant in mathematics, and they've long been suggested as a potential basis for communication with extraterrestrial intelligence. They're universal. Any technological civilization would discover prime numbers as a fundamental mathematical concept. If you want to signal that your transmission is artificial, that it's created by intelligence rather than natural phenomena, transmitting prime numbers is a good way to do it. My uncle tried to locate the source of the transmissions. He used directional antennas, triangulation, all the techniques amateur radio operators use to determine where a signal is coming from. But he couldn't pin down a location. The signal seemed to come from different directions at different times, or from multiple locations simultaneously, or from no particular location at all. It was consistent in strength and clarity, no matter which direction his antenna pointed, which shouldn't be physically possible. He mentioned this to other amateur radio operators in his area, asked if anyone else was receiving these transmissions. A few confirmed they'd noticed unusual activity on that frequency, but most either hadn't been monitoring it or dismissed what they'd heard as some kind of data transmission from a commercial or military source. After about 2 weeks of receiving the prime number sequence, the transmission changed. It continued broadcasting primes, but now it was interspersing them with what sounded like voice, fragments of speech, words and phrases in English, but distorted, processed, as if someone was sampling voice audio and mixing it with the numerical data. My uncle recorded hours of these transmissions, trying to isolate the voice components and understand what was being said. Most of it was unintelligible, cut up and rearranged in ways that destroyed meaning. But occasionally, he'd catch clear phrases, receiving confirmation, pattern recognized, establishing parameters, things that sounded like technical communications, but with no clear context. Then came the night that ended his hobby. He was in his radio room around 2 a.m, monitoring the strange frequency and recording the transmissions. The prime numbers were being broadcast as usual, interspersed with the voice fragments. He was making notes, trying to catalog the different phrases he was hearing. And then he heard his own voice, not similar to his voice, not someone who sounded like him, his actual voice, speaking words he'd said earlier that day. The transmission played back a conversation he'd had with his wife at dinner, discussing plans for the weekend. Then it shifted to something he'd said on the phone to a colleague at work. Then a comment he'd made to himself while working in the garden. These were private conversations, moments from his day that nobody should have been recording, and they were being played back to him through his radio receiver mixed with prime numbers, as if whatever was transmitting was demonstrating that it could monitor him, could record his voice, could play back his own words to him. He sat there frozen, listening to fragments of his own voice coming through the speaker, interspersed with primes and technical phrases. Then the transmission shifted again, and it was counting. 19, 23, 29, 31, 37. But now each prime was being spoken in his voice, as if the transmission was using his own speech patterns to deliver the numerical sequence. My uncle reached for his microphone, intending to respond, to challenge the transmission, to demand identification. But before he could speak, he noticed something on the far side of the room. Shadows were forming, coalescing, taking shapes that didn't match any light source in the room. They were geometric, triangles, hexagons, complex polyhedra, floating in the air, rotating slowly, as if they were projections, but there was no projector. As the transmission continued, primes in his voice, technical phrases in distorted English, the shadows became more defined, more numerous. They filled the room, a slow dance of geometric shapes that seemed to be following the rhythm of the transmission, pulsing in time with the broadcast primes. He stood up, backed away from his equipment, watching the shadows rotate and shift. They weren't threatening exactly, but they were profoundly wrong, a violation of how reality was supposed to work. Shadows should be cast by objects blocking light. These shadows had no source, no physical objects creating them, no lights producing them. They simply existed, responding to the radio transmission, manifesting in his room in ways that suggested the broadcast wasn't just electromagnetic waves, but something more, something that could affect physical space. The transmission reached prime 19 again, 19 in his own voice, and then stopped. Complete silence on the frequency, dead air where the broadcast had been. And with the silence, the shadows disappeared, fading instantly as if they'd never been. My uncle immediately shut down all his radio equipment, unplugged everything, and left the room. He woke his wife, told her something had happened, that he needed to stay away from the radio room. She thought he'd had a nightmare or was suffering from exhaustion. He'd been spending too many late nights monitoring that strange frequency, she said, and it was affecting his judgment. But the next day, he went back to the room and played back his recordings. The prime number transmissions were there, the voice fragments, everything he remembered hearing. But the parts where his own voice had been used were silent on the recording. Just gaps, dead air, as if those portions hadn't been transmitted or his equipment had failed to record them. The recording cut out exactly at the moments when the transmission had been most personally directed at him. He tried to monitor the frequency again, see if the transmissions would resume, but that frequency was silent, dead quiet, no primes, no voice fragments, no unusual activity at all. He checked other frequencies, scanned through the entire band, but found nothing similar. Whatever had been broadcasting, it had stopped completely after that night. My uncle dismantled his radio equipment over the following weeks. He told the family he was losing interest in the hobby, that he wanted to focus on other pursuits. But my aunt told me years later that he was afraid, that he'd had an experience he couldn't explain and didn't want to repeat. The one piece of equipment he kept was his shortwave receiver, and sometimes late at night he'd listen to it, scanning slowly through frequencies, listening for any sign that the transmissions had resumed. He'd sit in the dark, headphones on, turning the dial slowly through the static, searching for prime numbers or voice fragments or any indication that he was being monitored again. He died in 2003, heart failure, nothing mysterious about it. But when we were clearing out his house, we found journals he'd kept about the transmissions, pages and pages of notes about the prime number sequences, transcriptions of the voice fragments, theories about what had been transmitting and why. The final entry, dated the night he heard his own voice and saw the geometric shadows, ended mid-sentence. The transmission is using my voice to count primes. The shadows are forming patterns that match the numerical sequence. They're not broadcasting to me. They're broadcasting through me, or they're using my presence as some kind of receiver or decoder. I think, and that's where it stopped. Whatever he'd been about to write, he never finished. The page was blank below those words, and the next pages in the journal were empty, never used. I kept those journals. I've read through them dozens of times, trying to understand what he experienced, what the transmissions were, where they came from. The technical details he recorded are precise: frequency, signal strength, time stamps, everything documented with the thoroughness of a communications engineer. But the content is impossible. Prime numbers broadcast from no identifiable location, voice fragments that shouldn't have been accessible, personal audio played back through radio equipment that shouldn't have been able to receive or transmit it. I've asked engineers and physicists whether there's any conventional explanation for what he described. The consensus is that while some of it might be explainable, unusual radio propagation, interference from commercial transmissions, perhaps some psychological elements born from spending too many hours alone monitoring static, the totality doesn't fit any known phenomena, especially the shadows. Radio waves don't produce visible geometric shadows. That's not how electromagnetic radiation works. So I'm left with my uncle's journals, his recordings that have gaps where the most important parts should be, and the knowledge that something happened in that radio room in 1991 that was significant enough to make him abandon a lifelong hobby immediately and completely. I think about his final journal entry sometimes, about what he was going to write after. I think, what theory was he forming? What realization was dawning on him that made him stop writing and apparently stop his involvement with radio permanently? And I think about the shadows, geometric shapes pulsing in time with broadcast prime numbers. If the transmission wasn't just radio waves, if it was something that could manifest physically, create visible phenomena in response to electromagnetic signals, then what was it? Not human technology, probably. Not any radio technique we understand. Something else using our frequencies, our wavelengths, our portion of the electromagnetic spectrum to communicate or to manifest or to do something we don't have language for. My uncle was a rational man, an engineer, someone who understood radio waves and electromagnetic propagation better than most people. If he encountered something that frightened him enough to abandon his hobby, I believe it was real. I believe the transmissions were genuine, the shadows were actual phenomena, and that something was reaching across distance or across dimensions or across whatever gap separates their reality from ours, using prime numbers and stolen voices and geometric projections to make contact or conduct research or achieve some purpose we can't fathom. Every signal starts with someone trying to reach across the dark, but what happens when something answers back, when the response comes not from another amateur radio operator somewhere else on Earth, but from somewhere else entirely, somewhere that uses our voices without permission, that manifests shadows that shouldn't exist, that counts primes and borrowed speech? My uncle found out, and whatever he learned in that moment before he stopped writing, before he shut down his equipment and walked away, was significant enough that he never wanted to risk discovering more. Closing. We've gathered these accounts tonight because they represent something important, not just strange experiences that defy easy explanation, but moments of genuine contact with something outside our ordinary understanding of reality. The people who shared these stories aren't seeking attention or profit. They're simply trying to make sense of experiences that changed them, that left them with questions they'll probably carry for the rest of their lives. What did they encounter? Were these extraterrestrial beings, travelers from distant worlds, exploring Earth and studying its inhabitants? Were they interdimensional entities, existing alongside our reality but normally invisible, occasionally slipping through into our perceptual range under certain conditions? Were they something else entirely, something our categories of alien and interdimensional can't adequately capture? The witnesses themselves don't always agree. The man at Lake Superior thought he encountered something that could perceive consciousness directly, that spoke through his own thoughts in ways that suggested either advanced technology or fundamentally different modes of existence. The trucker on the Nevada highway met someone who flickered with lightning and vanished from a locked truck, something that seemed to be searching for others and thanked him for stopping. The retired teacher watched small figures examine his apple trees with scientific instruments, experiencing 10 seconds of absolute silence while being assessed by eyes that didn't seem entirely physical. Each account described something impossible that nonetheless happened, something that left physical traces, footprints leading into forest, scorch marks in grass, shadows that formed geometric patterns. These weren't hallucinations or dreams. They were real events experienced by rational people who understand the difference between imagination and observation. What unites these encounters is a sense of being noticed, of being seen by intelligences that operate according to rules we don't understand. The light visitor knew the man's thoughts and memories. The highway woman knew things about the others that suggested a larger pattern the trucker couldn't perceive. The orchard visitors were conducting research that enhanced the trees they examined. The light under the floorboards connected with sleeping children through dreams, pulsing in rhythm with their heartbeats. The radio transmission used a man's own voice to count primes and manifested shadows in physical space. These aren't abstract phenomena observed from a distance. These are direct interactions, personal encounters where the boundary between us and them became thin enough to permit contact, communication, exchange of information, or attention or awareness. And they all ended ambiguously. The lake visitor disappeared and hasn't returned. The highway woman vanished mid-journey. The orchard beings completed their research and left. The underground light withdrew when disturbed. The radio transmission stopped after demonstrating they could monitor and play back private conversations. Each encounter reached a natural conclusion, as if whatever was initiating contact had accomplished its purpose or decided further interaction wasn't necessary or appropriate. This might be the most significant pattern, not just that these encounters happen, but that they happen briefly, incompletely, leaving witnesses with experiences they can't forget but also can't fully understand or integrate. Maybe this is intentional, a way of minimizing disruption while still making contact. Or maybe it's simply the nature of encounters between radically different forms of intelligence or consciousness. We can touch briefly, exchange information or awareness at the boundaries where our realities overlap. But sustained interaction isn't possible with the gaps in our perceptions and understanding. Maybe they're travelers between stars, visiting Earth as part of some larger exploration or study program we can only glimpse fragments of. Maybe They're echoes from dimensions that border ours, occasionally visible when conditions align in ways that allow them to manifest in our space. Maybe they've been here longer than we have, watching human civilization develop, occasionally revealing themselves to individuals under circumstances that suit their purposes. Whatever they are, they've been watching long enough to know our names, to access our memories, to use our voices and our thoughts. They know when we're listening, when we're quiet enough or aware enough or alone enough to perceive them. They can choose to make themselves visible or remain hidden, to interact or simply observe, to speak through our own mental processes, or to impose silence while they assess us. That should probably be frightening, but most of the witnesses describe feeling something closer to wonder or curiosity than fear. Yes, there's anxiety in encountering the impossible. Yes, there's stress in having your understanding of reality challenged fundamentally, but there's also a strange privilege in being noticed, in being chosen for contact, in having confirmation that the universe is stranger and more populated than consensus reality acknowledges. These witnesses have seen beyond the veil, touched something outside ordinary experience, and returned to tell us about it as best they can with language that wasn't designed to describe beings made of light, or women who flicker with lightning, or transmissions that manifest geometric shadows. They've done their best to preserve the experiences in words, knowing the words are inadequate, knowing the accounts will sound impossible to people who haven't had similar encounters, but sharing them anyway, because someone needs to document these moments, needs to maintain the record that contact is happening, has been happening, will likely continue to happen. So we've gathered these accounts tonight, offered them to you in the quiet hours when the boundaries of the real feel softer, when you're close to sleep and your consciousness is more flexible, more open to possibilities your waking mind might dismiss. We've invited you into these experiences, let you walk beside these witnesses through their encounters, let you feel some of what they felt when they realized they were in the presence of something genuinely other. And we leave you with questions rather than answers, because the questions are what matter. The questions keep us looking, keep us noticing, keep us aware that our understanding of reality is incomplete, and that the universe contains more than we've been told or taught to expect. Have you ever felt that strange calm, that sense that something just stepped through, and you almost caught it? Have you ever experienced a moment of impossible silence, or seen light that behaved wrong, or heard your own thoughts echoed back from somewhere they shouldn't be? Have you ever suspected, even briefly, that you weren't alone, that something was watching, not with menace, but with that same scientific curiosity the orchard being showed, assessing and cataloging and perhaps wondering what you make of them? These encounters suggest we're living in a universe more complex and more populated than mainstream science acknowledges. Not a universe where every light in the sky is a spacecraft, or every strange experience is proof of alien visitation, but one where genuine contact happens occasionally, under conditions we don't fully understand, leaving witnesses changed and grateful and burdened with knowledge they can't fully communicate. Maybe you'll be one of those witnesses someday, if you haven't been already. Maybe you'll find yourself by a lake watching light that doesn't reflect on water, or picking up a hitchhiker who asks about the others, or seeing beings examine your property with instruments that leave scorch marks, or feeling light pulse beneath your floor in rhythm with your heartbeat, or hearing your own voice broadcast back to you through equipment that shouldn't be able to capture it. If that happens, you'll understand what these witnesses experienced, the mixture of wonder and fear and certainty that comes from direct contact with the impossible. And you'll face the choice they faced, stay silent and carry it alone, or share the account knowing most people won't believe you, hoping that someone somewhere will recognize something familiar in your experience and help you feel less isolated in your knowledge. We hope these stories have carried you gently toward rest, that they've opened your awareness without troubling your sleep, that they've reminded you the universe is vast and strange and more populated than our daily routines suggest. We hope they've helped you feel connected to something larger than yourself, to the grand mystery of consciousness and existence, and the question of what else shares the cosmos with us. Sleep well wherever you are. The stars are still watching, the shadows still form their patterns, the lights still move in ways that water can't reflect, and somewhere, someone else is having an encounter, experiencing something impossible, becoming another witness to add to the growing collection of accounts that suggest reality is more permeable, more populated, and more remarkable than we typically allow ourselves to believe. These are true stories from the quiet side of the unknown. These are the moments between stars and shadows. These are the accounts of people who looked beyond ordinary experience and found something looking back. Rest easy, the mysteries remain, and maybe, just maybe, that's exactly how they're meant to remain. Present but elusive, real but unproven, touching us briefly before withdrawing, leaving us changed by encounters we can remember but can't explain, can't forget but can't fully share, can only carry forward as private knowledge that the universe is stranger and more wonderful than most people will ever know. Sweet dreams. The beings are still out there, still watching, still occasionally making contact with the quiet ones who notice them. And perhaps tomorrow, or next week, or someday when conditions align and awareness peaks and the boundaries thin just enough, you'll be one of the ones they choose to notice back. Until then, sleep well. The stories will still be here when you wake. True stories from between the stars and shadows, from that liminal space where the impossible and the experienced coexist without contradiction, where witnesses carry on with ordinary lives while holding extraordinary knowledge, where reality is broader and deeper and stranger than consensus allows. These are their stories. These are their truths. And somewhere in the quiet hours between sleeping and waking, you might just hear your own thoughts echo back from somewhere they shouldn't, or see light that doesn't reflect quite right, or feel the presence of something watching with ancient patience and endless curiosity from just beyond the edge of your ordinary perception. Good night, rest easy, and remember, sometimes the sky looks back.